Hi everyone, thank you for being here. So I guess I'll start with where I'm coming from. My background is creative. I started with, let's say, visual arts as a teenager, as a child almost. And then in my early 20s, started a magazine because I wanted to collaborate with other awesome people. The magazine grew into a creative agency, and we're doing some of the cooler work for awesome brands from the design industry to technology. And 3 years ago I stepped out to really fully focus on the future. And since then I've been living this sort of technological nomad life, as Dav said, going around the world in search of the future and future people and future ideas. And as I say, my large focus is really the future. My narrow focus is the future of manufacturing and consumption of content, experience, and information. And sort of my narrow working focus is visual futurism and new media, sort of new immersive media, mostly augmented and virtual reality. So I do creative direction and I do strategy. But more than anything, what I really love is connecting people, connecting the dots, and sort of building the bridges where we still have borders between cultures, between disciplines, between generations, between genders, and more importantly, between ideas, because I believe that ideas have consequences. And if we can imagine the future that we want to go to, or the future that we really don't want to go to, then maybe we can work backwards. So that's where I'm at today. I work with some of the leading people in entertainment industry in Hollywood, helping them to imagine the future, helping them understand what are those stories of the future, what is the visual language of the future, but also how do you do things in a futuristic, innovative way. I also consult technology companies and even some investment funds. So I think my creative and sort of art background is something quite interesting in this picture, because today I mostly hang out with scientists and technologists, and working in augmented and virtual reality space, I really look into the nerdy bits. I really look into what is the technology, what are the distribution platforms, what are the monetization models, and how that can allow for creativity, because I really don't believe that creative has to be niche. I really believe that technology needs poetry, and I really believe that art should not be defined by something that is in a white cube. I think art should enter the popular culture. I think art should enter the city fabric. I think art should be part of the popular media. So I'd love to see if you guys have any questions. I'd love to talk a little bit more about augmented and virtual reality, because that's such a hot topic right now, and that's, I think, where a lot of my focus lies. But really, my main interest in virtual reality is not like it's a new medium of entertainment, nor for me it is new technology. I think it's just, we're living in this very interesting moment where we used to define very clearly what was real and what was not. And what was real was the physical world. And what we are seeing, and especially what we will be seeing in the few years to come, is how that definition of reality will open up. And so, in some way, with virtual and augmented reality, I feel the world virtual almost does the disservice to it, because it implies that it is not something real. I think digital reality is a more accurate name for it. And if we could see it as a form of reality, that becomes much more interesting, and also opens up for us seeing what are the possibilities within it. And I think with possibilities and power comes great responsibility. And I haven't been seeing as much of responsibility in how people approach designing for the virtual space. Another interesting thought for me is that virtual reality is not a medium, it's a result achieved. So unless you are transported, unless you are transformed by the experience that you stepped in, unless that digital reality feels as real as physical, it is not virtual reality. Just because something has been stuffed in a headset doesn't make it virtual reality. It's really this act of going into a digital space, yet feeling and having an experience of it, as if it was a form of reality. So what you are seeing here is one of my world design projects for a pretty iconic sci-fi entertainment property, a really big one. I cannot tell you exactly what it is. And so what I did here, I helped the director imagine what that world could look like. I came in really, really early stage, before really there was any team attached, before the script was finalized, and I tried to imagine how that world could look like. What is that city like? What are the inner spaces of the city? What are the characters that live in a city? What is the technology? And so I only work on projects that are future related. I only kind of try to think, in that future space. But really, future is everything. And so I like to quote a couple of things that are very important for me. So, people ask me to predict the future when all I want to do is prevent it. Better yet, build it. Predicting the future is much too easy anyway. You look at the people around you, the street you stand on, the visible air you breathe, and predict more of the same. To hell with more. I want better. And that's Ray Bradbury. And another one by Bruce Sterling, who's one of my heroes and whose keynotes at South by Southwest is one of my favorite things, because he always punches you in the guts and tells you everything that doesn't work, and yet never batters you down, but actually inspires you to go and be part of the change that you want to see. So he says, no longer allow yourself to be hypnotized by the sense of technical novelty. Just refuse to go there. Accept that it is already passé and create it from that point of view. Try to make it news that stays news. Refuse the awe of the future. Refuse reverence to the past. If they're really the same thing, you need to approach them from the same perspective. And so everything I do is really about the awe, inspiring people with physical beauty, and that being the passageway for them into the message, into the conceptual framework, into the context that the idea of the world whose stories I'm telling would be set in. And yet, for me, it's never about shiny new things, at least I'd like to believe. It's not about gadgets. It's not about technology. It's really, what interests me is how the tools that we create ultimately create us. And it's not about sort of exploring the current state of technology, but really the ambition of technology and how technology really is us. So what you see in these visuals is a world I designed for this property, sort of the early stage concept design before our directors, production designers come in. So something that is a starting point. And one of the most important things for me, and it's something that I feel especially Hollywood is lacking, is really thinking, what is the experience of your audience in that world? And now, with the advance of immersive media, specifically augmented and virtual reality, your audience is not anymore an audience. They're not a passive viewer, they're actually a participant. So you're inviting them to spend time in that world. So what is going to be the experience you will be giving? So most of the sci-fi properties that you see, they're very either super dystopian, dark, and sort of dirty, and after you spend an hour and a half or 2 hours, even watching the film, and even more so in a VR experience, it's very hard for you to step back into your world and feel hopeful about the future. Or you get, these sort of Microsoft, corporate type of communication, or, Oblivion, Tron type of futures that are so aseptic and so clean and so graphic. Speaking about Tron, also so cold, that again, in the immersive new media, you really wouldn't be spending a lot of time in there because you just feel alienated in that world. And so what interests me is how can we design the kind of worlds that people will want to spend time in. So when I was in my early teens, I did photography, and then in my early 20s, I did a magazine, and somebody recently was looking through the pictures of my magazine. You can find it online, or I can send it to you. And I looked at it, and they were like, basically, you're doing VR on paper. And I was like, actually, when you're telling me that, it totally makes sense. From the time I was a kid, when I'd go to movie theater, I always wanted to sit in the front row. I always wanted to be in it. I always wanted to be part of that world. And now finally VR is here, and so I can really think, anything is possible. We can create anything. We can prototype anything. We can prototype futures. And that's the most interesting thing for me about VR, is that we can actually create spaces and situations and worlds and scenarios that we can put people in and let them walk through it and let them experience, and then make their own choices and raise their awareness of what is the kind of future that they want to be part of, and maybe inspire and sort of empower them to take whatever action that is. So this is what really interests me a lot. And however, what I've been observing today in the space of virtual reality is people are dragging the old habits and the old media into this new medium, and they're looking at it only as if it were a new iteration of entertainment, yet it is so much more. And the biggest difference in that, and the reason why I view virtual reality as a new type of reality, alike to physical reality or a dream reality, is because finally we out of that cage of rectangular frame that is the screen, or that used to be the painting, or that used to be the photograph, or that used to be even a cave painting. It was always something that was external to us. It was something that we were looking at. And we could imagine to be part of it the way I did when I was a kid, going to the movie theater, wanting to sit the front row so I'd be enveloped by that image. But now we're finally in there. So with augmented reality, we're inviting augmented and mixed reality, what Magic Leap does, we're inviting the digital content to step into our physical world. And with the virtual reality, we are, stepping with our physical body into the virtual world, into the digital world. And today, the content is still fairly primitive. So, you see 360 video being called virtual reality, whereas it's just a wraparound video experience in a headset. It is not VR, because you do not have any agency, you do not interact with it. But where the bleeding edge lies is really us fully being in that space with our entire body, what we experience being sort of like modified, changed, or affected by artificial intelligence that could look into what is our own story, what is our own experience, and modify the content according to that. We're looking into advance in everything that gives you tactile feedback, so you could actually feel the digital space with your physical body. You could feel the texture, you could feel the weight, you could feel the pressure. We're talking about the wearables and robotics that again take you even further in that space. And so, it really blurs the lines between what is real and what is not. And yet, mostly what we see today is people working on first-person shooters and horror-based experiences, thinking that, it will affect you very easily, so that's cool. Except that if it does affect you like reality, or it's more like something between reality and a dream, you know, the trauma can be very, very real, you know? And there's all these videos of people freaking out, you know, in VR that are being shared on YouTube, and other people looking at it and laughing and saying, oh, VR is very real, look at this person. They freaked out, you know, except that they really did freak out. And there will be such a thing as, you know, the PTSD, you know, from VR, and people will refuse to go back in there because they had such a traumatizing experience. So what personally really interests me is how, in the advent of this new media, we could create really meaningful things with it. How we could bring people into the world and let them experience them, and let them carry out something that is meaning to their physical life, for their physical self. So either expanding their intellectual horizons, or opening them new creative possibilities, or giving them new skills, or giving them better understanding of their body. But that not being a didactic experience. I believe that that can be just as fun, or way more fun, than what we have today with, you know, the blockbuster Hollywood movies. Because we can play with the same spectacular visual world as you see, you know, in these slideshows. I'm all about the spectacular, but I feel that spectacular doesn't have to be decoupled from meaning. And so how do I do that? When I had my magazine, I had the chance to work with some of the most extraordinary artists across the fields. And artists, be they visual artists, or designers, or architects, or scientists, or technologists, I view all of them as artists. Because whenever you're breaking new ground and striving for excellence, that is not quantitative excellence, but qualitative excellence, I believe you are an artist, because you're inventing something new, something different. And, you know, what interests me is how we can look into what are the most interesting things happening in the world today. Who are the coolest, craziest, most awesome, avant-garde artists around the world doing incredible things? What are the technologists, what are the scientists that are thinking of new possibilities and new avenues and new theories and new technologies? And how they could be brought to collaborate on that world, on that work of fiction, on that world of fiction. And so we could create a fictional world that is so compelling that it bleeds back to life. And we could overlay our sort of like thinking of possible futures with poetry that inspires people to use their own creativity, you know, in how they approach the future. Because I believe future is not just about solving the practical problems and feeding the people, but it's really about inspiring people to be creative wherever they are. And in my travels, really around the world, you know, I haven't been to Antarctica and not yet Australia, but mostly, and not enough in Africa, but mostly everywhere else, I realized that creativity is everywhere. It's not reserved for the privileged population. Actually, there is more creativity for people that do not have the wealth or access, because that their creativity remains one of the very few things that they do possess. And so everybody wants to invent possible realities, and how do we empower and inspire them to do that and bring poetry into sort of their everyday life. So these are the things that I am very interested in and strive for, and I think you can get a glimpse into in these world design decks. What I did besides that is, you know, instead of just thinking visual, you know, I also create strategy. So for me, it's not just about making beautiful aesthetical choices, but thinking, how do they make sense? So how, by choosing certain conceptual framework, we can marry it with our aesthetical and design choices. And by doing that, what are strategic brand partnerships that we can establish? And what are the collaborations, creative collaborations we can build with people? And by doing that, how do we open us to new audiences? How do we embed the viral marketing within the products? We don't even need to push out and market that thing we created But just by the nature of people that are involved and the story that we are telling and how it's set in the context of the world that we live in today, you know, it becomes something that goes viral by itself with a little push here and there. And how that opens sort of new avenues for revenue and funding. So this is everything that I'm looking at, and I'd be super interested to kind of start a conversation, whatever questions you have, and specifically in the virtual reality space, because I think about it a lot and go to, you know, many conferences and listen to what people say and think about it and try to make sense and think, you know, what is interesting, what can be successful, but also realize our responsibility in making things that actually expands us as humanity and not cripple us or sort of disable or disempower us even more. What I say is that, you know, media is the modern day mythology, and I think a lot about digital waste. I think a lot about media toxicity and responsibility of media creators, and we are all media creators. Some of us have louder voices. We have, you know, millions of followers, or the media we created will be seen, you know, in 150 countries around the world, and so bigger responsibility comes with that. But even with our own media channels, we are sort of like portraying a world, and somebody is affected by that world. And be it just 10 people or millions of people, the world is changed by us. You know, so there's a, you know, the trendy hashtag is futures now. Look at this, this is so cool, this is futuristic, this is, you know, shiny and gadgety, futures now, futures happening right now. And I used to use that. And now, I think more sort of hashtag now is the future. So everything that we do now, this conversation that we're having, every person that I can inspire, every person that does inspire me, every person that shows me where my thinking was wrong, changes the future. Because then I can go and design better worlds or inspire people in a better way. Or, you know, when I'm consulting one of the largest financial institutions and telling them what they should be investing in, instead of telling them, oh yeah, invest in this first-person shooter game, because it'll be very commercially successful, I can show them, no, that other thing that is super awesome and will actually be better for humanity can be just as successful, so why don't you invest in that? So these things that interest me a lot. I'd love you guys to enter the conversation. Anyone?
I have a question. Do you have any examples of those sort of inspirational digital realities that you would rather point people towards than first-person shooters? Or like things in the world that inspire you that way?
In virtual reality space?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, so there aren't that many things today that I find really awesome, and that's why, you know, I sort of consult and talk at the conferences, and now everybody's like, yo, we should just go and do it. and I am actually working on something that we will be producing some sort of virtual reality content. But there are some cool things. So I really like what CCP Games are doing. So I don't know if all of you guys know, it's an Icelandic company. They started EVE Online. EVE Online is one of the largest multiplayer video games, and they had a pretty large investment in their R&D, and so they sort of pushing the boundaries in terms of what the future of virtual reality could be. And in their R&D stuff, they're working on full body sort of immersive experiences. So essentially, you know, your body's fully tracked and you can interact with the digital content in that way. And I can tell you it's pretty damn magic. So one of their demos, essentially, you know, you see your entire body, you see, you know, you are in a headset, you see your entire body, but you can touch different things. Like you can take this like fireball and throw it at the wall, and that, you know, breaks the wall. And so, you know, you are like that avatar in the future space, but you are you. and you can interact with that futuristic digital world with the entirety of your body, not just with your hands, which sort of leap motion does, and your hands really aren't your hands. You can touch that digital wall with your elbow or with your knee or kick it and stuff like that. And it's really quite interesting. Another demo that they have is essentially sort of like, it's just a demo, it's a test, and it's a bit of a Tron ripoff, but that's what those things are. Unfortunately, I say we kind of living in a demo land, and people are producing the demos like they're demos, and I every time I get the chance to speak with people that are doing that, I'm like, you're doing it anyways. It's taking your time, energy, money. Why don't you just add additional 30% budget and hire awesome creatives and get them figure out that visual world for you, so then the technology and idea that you're developing will also be visually impactful. But anyways, their sort of Tron, demo is pretty cool because your body's being fully tracked. The other person's body, who can be in the next room or in the next house or somewhere else in a city. I don't know how that would work if they would be, let's say, in Japan. Maybe the latency would not be great because of the internet connection. But essentially, you are you, that other person is them, you can see them, you can see yourself, and you're throwing these discs at each other. And you're in this futuristic Tron-like space that is unfortunately all blue and graphic and cold. That's a pity. I wish it were more atmospheric and more warm and more cocooning, from sort of what I was saying about sort of designing for VR. I think that is sorely needed, these more atmospheric spaces. But even despite that, you are you, that person is them, you're interacting with them, but you're doing this super crazy futuristic stuff that you couldn't do in reality. Not now, not anytime soon. And it's a lot of fun. Because you have the agency of your body, and you are taking these digital elements and you are throwing in them, and they're bouncing off, and you sort of like escaping them. And you're not gonna die. That's a cool thing. You don't have to rush. You're just playing with this other person, and you're learning how to be more accurate. You're learning how to manipulate that content and those digital things, but you don't feel threatened. And you don't feel you gotta rush, and you don't feel like you have to escape. And yet, it's just as fun. And so that's something I like a lot. And kind of riffing off that, I don't want to say any bad things about anybody, but I posted it anyways on my social media, So, I was doing this Walking Dead demo, and essentially put you in a wheelchair, and you gotta shoot at zombies. And it's really friggin' scary, and they attack you, and it's just all creepy, and you are this cripple in this wheelchair trying to not die. And I'm like, naturally, the first thing when I think about virtual reality is that. I want to be a cripple in a wheelchair, being attacked by really freaky monsters. I'm like, that is not true. I bet I would ask almost anybody of you, and that's not what you want. What you want is to fly. What you want is to have these new capabilities, to have this new freedom, to be able to sort of like expand in that digital space. And we all know how stressful our lives are today and how competitive our world is. And so the last thing that we want is step into the digital space and come back from it even worse than we were off before we entered it. And so I'm just really, really interested in everything that in some way, is as awesome and as entertaining, but sort of brings us into that peaceful inner world through this medium. So another cool example, Icelandic people again. I love Iceland, so I'm biased. And these guys are Solfar, and they are original co-founders of CCP that left to start this new startup. And they did Everest VR. So it's a demo for HTC Vive, and essentially, you are walking on the Mount Everest. So, you can walk across the bridge, you can climb up the ladder, you can look down in the abyss, and the way they built it, they used the assets by RVX, the visual effects company that did Everest movie. So it's very, very accurate. But it's not like a 360 sort of like it's not just a recreation of Everest. It's something even more than Everest. The way they, done the light on it, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful experience. And so you have this possibility to find yourself on Mount Everest and look around and just see how gorgeous it is. But it's like even, in some ways, even more than what you could do, in real life. And when I was with them and we started chatting, I was like, damn guys, you should also do it not just in one specific light. You should do it with sunrise and sunset and potentially a snowstorm or, the full moon. Because that's something that even if you were fit enough, even if you had enough time or financial capabilities to go and climb Mount Everest, like, you really won't be walking in a snowstorm. You'll die, or you won't be climbing it at certain hours because, the schedule is very precise when you have the right to go up to Everest, to be able to safely return. However, in VR, you could do all these things. And instead of just hiking up and climbing and rushing to reach the top of a mountain and come down and say that you've been there, you can actually stay as long as you want. And you can look around and you can look there and here. And so again, for me, that brings me to thinking that, in the space of digital reality, let's not try to just reproduce the reality. Let's create somewhere in that space between reality and a dream. Let's aim for more. Let's use, instead of sort of being frustrated why we can't, the resolution that we have today is of course very far from reality. And yesterday I was with a friend of mine, who's working, who's the head of VR for one of the largest companies here. And we're talking about projections, when it's finally going to reach 16K and sort of basically then it would look like reality. And it's 10 years away or something. And so now we have these boundaries of the medium. But that's okay. And in all the conference circuit, people are like, oh, the content is not perfect because technology is not perfect. And I would say actually technology is ahead of our imagination. And the reason why we don't see a lot of these amazing experiences, and when I have really to sort of pick and say, what are these cool things? I've seen some other cool things, but they are not official and in development. I can't speak too much about it. But they actually are not many, because somehow, our imagination is lagging behind. And so often I say it's not a failure of technology, it's a failure of imagination, conversation, and collaboration. It's a failure of the technology companies not wanting to support the content. And that makes no sense to me, because you'll have all these headsets in the market, and if there's no amazing content, it makes no sense to buy them, especially knowing how fast they will become obsolete. And so the risk that we have right now, Sony PlayStation VR has no doubt it's going to sell a lot of their headsets, but specifically for the gamers, and specifically for a lot of that sort of like, first-person shooter type based content. And what I'm afraid is that it's going to create a bad reputation for virtual reality. And so, we have this opportunity, all of us. I mean, you guys here, myself, most of the people that I meet, it's not that difficult to enter the space of, creating virtual reality today. It's very difficult to actually yourself technically do it. Contrary to many people's opinion, VR is not easy. There's so much science actually involved in it. But it's possible to find people to collaborate with, to create those experiences. We have an opportunity to be part of the origin story of this new medium. And so I feel that we got a responsibility to find ourselves in a place of magic for it. And that's what I've been seeing today, and I feel it's really important to strive more for those kind of experiences that give us even more than reality. It doesn't try to poorly imitate reality, but creates these sort of alternatives. And we can play with the glitch, and we can play with imperfection, and even in the commercial space. You guys work with a lot of sort of world super recognized brands, and they tend to want and think something super realistic. You know, let's have something very realistic in that space. But that's not what the audience wants. For me, it's always about never give people what they expect, but give them everything they hope for. So experience is everything. Experience is more important than the story. Experience is more important than the medium. So people will forget what you said, how you said it, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And for me, you know, VR is all about the feeling. It's all about returning to the feeling and giving people these enriching experiences. Long answer to short question. Yep. Whichever.
So I'm a father of a daughter, 2 years, and I was wondering how you think about inspiring, creating a next generation of kids that actually contribute and have that imagination and that creativity to actually create all stress. I feel like, how do we inspire, how do virtual reality inspire this imagination and the creativity that we usually, it does, when I look at a little picture, it gives you one dimension, and you create the dots in between, right? That's where creativity happens, making all these experiences. And that's where you start to create it. Now the more real we get, the less there is space for imagination, in between. So what do you think is the space that virtual reality should play to be, you guys are looking, you create your own virtual world, it's not the real world, but I think it's still a crafted world. It's not your own imagination, it's someone else's design that world. So I wonder what you think from that.
Yeah, so actually, thank you so much for asking this question. I would have forgotten to speak about it. VR and kids it's a very topical subject. So we know that, we we are all prone to that, distinguishing sort of like what happened between what we thought or what we wanted is always a bit of that blurry line, but it is even more so with kids. So, and not many people are talking about this. Conversation is just starting to happen, and mostly in the context of psychologists and neuroscientists, and not actual sort of VR people. So, because we are not watching the content external to us anymore, we actually in it, we're basically creating virtual memories for people, but even more so for the kids. So, a friend of mine was telling how, his daughter did sort of one of the demos where they found themselves in a refugee camp in this sort of class. And then, half a year later, she was like, "Daddy, you remember when we were in that classroom?" And she described the classroom, and he was like, "What are you talking about?" And then he figured that in her head, that thing that she experienced in VR was actually a real thing. She remembered it as a real memory. So, great responsibility comes with that before the child's sort of mind is fully formed. And I don't think any of our mind is ever fully formed. So we all are more or less sensitive to that, depending on our sort of psychological state. Something really comes interesting in there. However, shielding the kids from virtual reality is not the right approach either. So, what I'm finding very, very interesting and super inspiring with the kids today is how they kind of hack things, and they'll make things how they want to see them. And there's this popular belief that VR is about isolation. And it can be just as anything else. But it's not the fault of virtual reality. It's not the fault of the smartphones. It's really the problems we have as people. We'll look at technology as this external thing to us, but it really is us. And our bad habits are ours. They're not the bad habits of technology, really. And so, what really interests me today is it's still quite hard to get in the VR space. And at South by Southwest, I was speaking on a panel with one of the guys, the founder of Matterport. And so they do sort of 3D scanning of physical places, and they go and scan. They can scan sort of any cool places around the world. And then at the end, somebody asked me, what would be the next cool thing for you? And I was like, how could we actually jam things? How could we take at this, scan sort of real place, whatever that is, some spectacular architectural building of Zaha Hadid or whatever, and place, for example, volumetrically filmed characters in it, be you or whoever, your favorite musician, etc. But then the last thing is, how could we take things that other people created and import elements of it? So, do you guys know about Tilbrush? HTC Vive Tilbrush? Yeah, so basically, now it's part of Google. They created sort of like 3D paint application. You can paint in the VR space, and it's super fun. But the truth is that it's also quite daunting. So when you step into it and you start painting, it's like super fun for the 5 minutes, and then you're like, but I can't really paint. And that's the case for most of us. And you're like, now where do I take it from there? And if you're really creative and really brave, you'll do that. However, if that's not your forte, you won't really take it necessarily further. And so, when I was chatting with the founder of Tilbrush, I was like, how cool it would be if we could actually take elements of things that some of the most prominent artists have created, and we could just take that part of their painting. The artists that create, in that Tilbrush space. And we could just take that element and import, and then I paint on top of it, or change the color. And then, even more so, what would be if I could bring in these assets from the games that I like? Or other VR experience, I could just take and import element of it. And, awesomely enough, I just met this young startup that essentially doing that. So you could grab elements of different games, and then you can import into the VR space and modify them and collage them together and build that world that way. And I think that is super, super interesting for the kids, how they'll be able to take different elements of different things they like and remix it, in that way. I think a lot of really creative things could happen in there. So, again, what interests me is how we can have agency over technology and not the other way around. How, people that are building these platforms today and the tools would think, instead of how do we create these hermetic systems, how do we give people opportunity to not just experience what we create, but then also jam it further. So I think that's, when your kids are going to be, able to step into that space, something like that will already be here. So they'll be able to play with it, and that's going to be cool. I hope.
So, it's 10 o'clock. I just wanted to, before people need to disperse, we wanted to get a photo of everyone here, and we can continue the conversation. But
sure.
We like to get a photo with fellow our speakers before, while Greta's still here. So if you could just come over here, and we can just do a quick photo, and then we can have maybe just kind of more one-on-one conversation.